It's strong. Are you getting able to look out the window?
After 2 weeks, I went back to work. And I had to sign my job. And the first time my arm hurt, then I had to.
Well, folks, welcome to the Jack Berry Lectureship.
I was 60 years old.
Oh, she gets stuff out.
She just wouldn't give it.
Living cats. Please. We're good. We started right after, we're still good.
That was so bad.
I'll be back in a second. Sure, real quick.
And I'm sorry. I just apologize the whole. Okay, excellent. Get it right now.
Yeah, it's okay.
Can we shut the door?
No, we're good. We're positive, super positive.
Oh, no, Walter's rising up.
No. Somebody put something in my pocket.
Don't tell them this whack-a-mole, please. Be nice. It is a job. Actually, guys, I'm happy you're here, and I'm extremely pleased to be here too. This is a 2022 Jack Williamson Lectureship series, and we have this book is going to be based on history of and in science fiction. I'm just going to read you something that you've probably seen, and then I'll introduce the folks. This is going to be a discussion of the history of science fiction and its development, as well as the use of history in science fiction. Now, I'm going to introduce the names of the folks that are here, and we have the wonderful Connie Willis. We've got Walter John Williams. We have Reese Hogan and Ian Trigillis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And for those two in the room who don't know these folks, I'm going to let them give a little quickie bio about themselves. So that sounds good to you. Sounds good to me.
Okay. I'm and I incorporate a lot of history into my writing. One of the loose, I can't really call it a series, but groups of novels that I write are about Oxford historians who can actually go back in time to the historical period that they're studying. So history is always a big part of it. And my claim to being on here for the history of science fiction is I was here at the very beginning, even before Jack. No, but I have been here for a chunk of science fiction's life.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Trigillis. I have 7 trad novels. In my day job, I'm a theoretical physicist, but for some reason, I tend to write novels and stories that have a historical element in them because I don't know anything about history. I wrote a trilogy that was genre-heavy World War II and the Cold War, which of course took quite a lot of research and made a lot of critics angry. I wrote a trilogy where robots were invented in 1675, and then did a lot of research trying to figure out how they could change politics, and religion, and philosophy, and then to extrapolate that 250 years in the future. In between those 2 trilogies, I wrote a standalone novel for set in the future, but I decided that one of the characters would speak in a 1920s lingo, so I could do a lot of research in sort of the history of the tropes of detective, the hard-boiled detective tropes. So I like to stick historical things in my novels just to make it
Hi, I'm Reese Hogan. I have come out with 3 novels, and I would say that kind of all of them have a historical element to it. In fact, I used to pitch myself as writing historical novels as a sci-fi writer. Although I've kind of strayed a little bit from that, but I've written, I have a fantasy world that resembles World War II from my last novel, Sharpwood, in 2019. And then my first indie published novel is 1928, Soviet Russia, All History, so City Toads. And then my second novel, Holding the Ashes, is apocalyptic, but it's Wild West feel. So I've done a lot of research for all those kinds of things, as well as other projects I've written.
I'm John Williams, and I'm going to make an admission, which is that I was on the last panel, for the last hour. And because I'm on 3 panels this afternoon, I actually forgot what panel I was on. So during my last panel, I gave the introduction I planned to give for this panel. I'm going to give it again, but if you've heard it before, just please bear with me. That I have a strange relationship with the history of science fiction, which is that many critics feel that science fiction began with Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. And I have written an alternative history about an alternative Mary Shelley and an alternative Frankenstein and an alternative Byron and an alternative which produced an alternative paradigm for science fiction by the end of that. And the story was called Wall Period, Stone Period, Craft Period. Yeah, that's right. It is college. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is Shelley nicer in this iteration?
He has been on. Although
That's
that's not
nicer.
necessarily the
That's
same
way
thing as
nicer.
nice, but yeah.
Way better than Morella, but
You seem to think he's worse than Byron. I mean, really.
no, I don't think he's worse than Byron. I just think he's as bad as Byron.
Well, I think you started something on that last words you were talking about, as far as where does sci-fi history start? You know, I'm sure it's debatable, and I'm sure it has its own views. What are the views of the panelists?
Well, I would, I think the only decent argument can be made of things that are way back of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's actually the science fiction novel. Yeah, and there's way more stuff that people say.
Century theory of Greece.
Yeah, exactly. Or even Gilgamesh and stuff. They kind of, yeah, but if you're going from science fiction that somebody wrote stuff and then other people immediately followed on, then you have to come forward to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and E.M. Forster, and basically the turn of the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, because that's where you can do whole connected line. From then on, we had science fiction instead of having this kind of this and then there's a big gap and then we have this and then we have, but those are all kinds of arguments.
I found it interesting, and I'm doing my research, is that the 1001 Arabian Nights, which is like the 8th and 7th centuries, had robots.
Right.
Robots. I just was shocked that robots were that early on.
Right.
I think to have science fiction, you have to have science. So you need it needs to be set somewhat in the modern world with somewhat modern attitudes. So even though there are automata in Arabian Nights, I think they're magical automata that would make them more the realm of fantasy. You can argue about Frankenstein that it might not be science fiction, it may be a Gothic novel because it has elements of both. But Mary Shelley's next book, The Last Man, definitely was science fiction.
Yes, absolutely.
It was set in the 22nd century. It was set during a period when the plague was killing all the people on Earth. And the title will tell you how that turned out, The Last Man. And that definitely was a science fiction book. So I think it did start with Mary Shelley. And the thing about Frankenstein is it gave you this huge metaphor of the scientist's creation turning on him. And that's something that every science fiction writer writes now. That idea is just a foundation of this field. And pretty much everybody has written a Frankenstein story, and I know I've written several without intending to. That's just how it turns out.
Oh, no.
This is fine. This is fine. When mentioning things going awry, I remember reading a while back with the loss of robots and things are wrong, and then it's certainly in the West world. And without that problem, we have a story. With without something falling apart or going bad.
And whether the unintended consequences are good or bad, there still have to be unintended consequences somewhere.
In my second trilogy, it is a Frankenstein story for sure.
Yeah.
These robots in the 1670s. And I thought I was very clearly setting up. Clearly, this is a story where a person made a world and things are going wrong. And it clearly the robots are going to throw up their shackles. You know, what is the story about? And not a lot. But I a few readers were like, I could tell that was these, that's the shape of the story. I mean, clearly that was the promise on page 1. It's like, this is a Frankenstein story. Ever since the first person met Frankenstein, it's going to go wrong at some point. So.
But we have some interesting things going on. I was talking to somebody earlier who likes science fiction and science, and I guess recently they're having tours go to the space station. What are your thoughts as far as
What
history
could
and
possibly go
science?
wrong?
That could be fodder for a whole new book series. But astronaut train, so to speak. How much of it, when you talk about science and history and things like that, how much of the real science do you use when you're writing books, for example, with growing tomatoes and all this stuff, plants to sustain yourself? There's a lot of research that goes on in your writings.
I think a lot of it depends on what story you're trying to tell, because of course, if you're writing a really immersive historical fiction, and I say historical fiction because you don't have to do historical sci-fi with that, but if you want it to be really immersive, yes, you want to research all of that, and I think you should research it anyway, but you might not want to put it all in for the same reasons you might not want to overbuild your fantasy, because not all readers are going to want to know all this. What you need to pay attention to is how those things are going to affect your main character. Because are they creating a problem for them? Are they helping their life? If it's not affecting your main character, it's probably not the part to worry about. That would be my
Yeah,
answer.
I do exactly as much research as is necessary. I know that's a little vague, but,
Do it as you go.
yeah, for my, depends on my deadline. Sometimes I get it done. That makes me happy when that happens. But very often I'm researching as I'm writing. And I'm happy that I know several scientists, Ian included, whose brains I can plug when I need to. So in my space opera series, I had to go into some detail on how space travel works, because it's different from Star Trek or whatever default you want. It goes through wormholes. So I talked to one of the 3 wormhole experts in the world, and who happens to be a science fiction writer, Jeff Landis. I said, well, how do wormholes work exactly? And he told me. And I talked to an antimatter guy, because it's antimatter that's powering the civilization. And I just carefully followed his recipes. But I did have to go into some detail of it just so that I could explain how all of this stuff works. When I came to explaining how a chemical rocket works, I don't have to explain that. People know. So that's kind of the standard rocket in a science fiction book, so I don't have to explain that. I don't explain what a laser beam is.
This is a phone.
Yeah.
Here's how it works.
Exactly.
As you know, Bob. That's how it works.
For a book that I haven't even written, but a book that I'm trying to figure out how to write, if I would write it, just to get to the stage of having a conversation with my literary agent about how we might pitch it, if we were to do it. I've been thinking about a secret history novel, and I don't know that I will ever write it. But for that, I've spent close to the majority of a decade researching it, just to figure out what the story would be, not to get not even get to the point that you're thinking about so what would affect my characters. But in the course of doing that, my notes on this project are longer than the book, actually. I talked to journalists who have research, because this is a secret history touching on things we didn't really remember. Short of procuring interviews with the player, with the people who were there, because former secretaries of state are not there. I've corresponded with archivists, they actually organized and gotten telephone transcripts of unredacted in the public domain. I've talked to the most preeminent living historian of the subject matter. I've talked to journalists who have done interviews with these people. I've gone into archives myself and made transcripts of things. So it's a voluminous amount of work just to figure out what the story would be. And I don't even know if I'm going to write the book. Partially because it is already broken. My wife constantly says she's afraid that as she comes into the writing office, and she's reading the beautiful mind wall with all the red twine. What she doesn't know is that I have it digitally. It's called Scrivener. But that's sort of the other extreme. You kind of go too far.
Over research.
Yeah.
Although I don't know how you know that it's over research.
But I knew I was going too far when I realized that doing the research had become a project. It wasn't in service of the project.
I think Reese is totally right, both in history and in science. What you need in the story is what affects your characters, and I think this is a mistake a lot of fantasy writers make. They massive. You need to know the entire political and monetary system. You're like, no, you don't. You really don't. You need to know how that affects your characters, and that's it. And science is the same way. In my time travel novels, that how the physical time travel machine thingy works, totally unimportant. It's unimportant to my characters, it's unimportant to you. You're gonna start, you wanna get the characters there and then unable to get them back. That's the main thing. So, and then it's very important that people understand the rules of time travel in my books, but not how the time machine itself works. There are other books like Greg Benford's Timescape, where how the time machine works is all important to the story. It is the story, you have to do it. But I think that if you, whatever you're, and in the same novels that I've written in the past, it's my characters are, I didn't. People always say, "Oh, you're such an expert on World War II." I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm an expert on the little pieces of World War II that my characters happen to be involved with. I know a lot about Dunkirk because one of them was there. I know a lot about London during the Blitz because they were there. I know a lot about Bletchley Park. I don't know anything about the war in the South Pacific. I would love to be able to research all the stuff about the war in the South Pacific, but not relevant to me.
Oh, yeah, I was researching a novel once. It never sold, but it involved a sort of conspiracy in the mid-18th century among certain members of the royal family and members of the Royal Society and members of the law courts and the Freemasons. And the deeper I got into researching this, the more I believed, I think there really was something going on.
This is QAnon.
It might not be the conspiracy that I'm writing about. It might be some other game. But I'm beginning to think that there really was something going on. And I realized, no, I'm a good writer. I came up with something that was in its own strange way plausible.
Well, one thing that, speaking to that is like Verne versus Wells, like two different schools of thought came out that Wells was more focused on characters and then ideas of society, whereas Verne wanted to explain all the science.
Right.
And they were completely different kind of approaches.
Yeah, Verne had the science right there because his previous project was he wrote an encyclopedia. He knew exactly where to look.
Yeah, it's across the right.
Yeah.
I reread some years ago.
Infodocs.
Your Ernex, what is this fish outside my poor home window? Well, let me give you the 7-page definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you take away the dissections of the pitch dissections, it was about 50%.
Well, and another thing is there's a number of different ways to use history in your work. You can do the alternative history, like Walter with Mary Shelley's story. You can do the history straight. That's what I do with mine. They actually are in the Middle Ages or in the real Blitz or the real World War II or whatever. Then there's the taking history, moving it into the future, and transforming it into a future. And a good example of that is Werner Vinci's Fire Upon the Deep, which is you're reading law, you're going, oh shit, this is Pearl Harbor. Oh my gosh, this is Pearl Harbor. And of course, not Pearl Harbor, it's out in space and it's set in, but it's Pearl Harbor. He obviously used that as his template for writing this future history. And some people do it very directly and others do it so you wouldn't necessarily even notice that was what they were doing. But those are ways of incorporating history into your work too, without having it directly there.
That's kind of what I did with Chicago, because some of the kind of the metric movement type things and transfer them to make sense.
Right. History is a great resource. No, it's so weird. It's so weird.
About not making it up, history to me, just seems daughter of time. And actually, it's for me, and I forgot to pack it with me, so no spoilers. But it's not necessarily a genre novel, but it's so fascinating to me. Someone trying to unravel something that's laying in a hospital bed.
Right.
I'm dying to finish it. Then I want to go to Wikipedia and find out what is known and how much is true. And just
And we could tell you, but.
What's the book?
Daughter of Time.
It's about the Richard II killing
Richard III.
Richard III killing the little princess in the tower.
Really good.
Yeah, I can't tell if the deduction is actually, because I'm ignorant of history, so it's great.
Yeah, it's very convincing when you're reading it.
It is very convincing while you're reading it. That's it. That's exactly
You
it.
don't know the history. I'm totally fine.
Yeah, she did a really good job. Yeah, that is the other thing. And like you talked about the secret history or the pocket history, the little part of history that nobody knows about that you can do and without damaging the bigger picture in history.
Yeah, I wrote a secret history, and I was really attracted to it, and I really liked it. I wrote one about the friendship between Nikola Tesla and Mark Twain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and because they were really real friends, and they had a very strange relationship. And what turns out to be a kind of undeclared war between them creates our modern world. So it's basically Mark Twain versus the singularity.
All right.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Tim Powers' Claire is a novel I really admire, and part of it is a secret history of the life of Kim Philby, where I think he researched Kim Philby for a number of years and then tried to not change any of the known documented facts about the life. Kim Philby was one of the 5 infamous spies at MI6, and I think Powers was researching the life of Philby, and I'm like, oh, he had a pet fox. And then his pet fox died, and then all these other weird things happened. And then he built this magical undercurrent thing that explains sort of the entire Cold War and the second half of the 20th century.
Oh my God, and a fox was just in Congress?
Yes.
And
Yes.
he was rabid and he bit 9 people and they're all having to have a shot.
Did you get a Medal of Honor for it?
No, this really happened just
Yeah.
now.
No, this was last week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
last week there was a fox that was out there doing it.
Maybe this has something to do
Yeah.
with Kim Philby. Right, that's why you can't make it up. You cannot make it up. It's just, it will defeat you every time. In World War II, so the Luftwaffe was going after the British airplanes, okay? And they were doing a really good job, and they were slowly, with a lot of attrition. And pretty soon, the goal was get all the aircraft out of the air, and then you can march into London. Okay, so with 2 weeks, they have looked back at it, and if he had kept up this plan of hitting the airfields exclusively, another 2 weeks, he could have destroyed the RAF. He could have marched into London, the story would be completely different. But 2 pilots got lost in the fog. 2 Luftwaffe pilots got lost. They were supposed to, couldn't get back. Nobody could get back with their bombs on board because they Yeah. So they were told to go out over the channel and drop their bombs if they couldn't find their target. They went over what they thought was the channel. It wasn't the channel, it was a suburb of London. And they killed a bunch of civilians, like 9 civilians. Okay. Churchill immediately said, okay, we're going after Berlin. He went after Berlin. Hitler had promised never to allow the homeland to be bombed. He lost his temper completely and started the London Blitz, bombing civilians and buildings, just great, okay. And as a result, the RAF survived, and so and you're just like, if you put that in a book, if you had that in your book, no one would ever be like, oh, come on, ridiculous, yeah. So, which is why I wish there were a form of writing where we could have little footnotes and we're like, no, really, this really happened. Look it up, you know.
Why can't you have that form of writing? I always wanted to see books where you put the footnotes in. Tell me what's real and what's not.
That's true. I think, well, in 1776, the play, they used the real lines of things that the founding fathers actually said all the time. And there is a speech that John Adams made about slavery. And he said, I tell you, if we leave slavery in here, we will pay for it within 100 years and it will tear this country apart. And they decided they could not use the line, even though it was totally real, because everybody would think they made it up. And you can't really, in the middle of a play where you're all emotionally involved, step to the front of the stage and say, no, really, you really said that, Boss. Yeah, but it would be nice. It would be nice to know that.
I'm just gonna throw this out there. There was, maybe I saw a while back, and it was called Contact. And with, and in that they were using this is the Berlin Olympics with Hitler to put their message out back to people, because it was something that was transplanted out in space. Are there, does that give you ideas, or not necessarily that same thing, but are there things that you use historically when you're writing, like, hey, I could use this in my book, something that actually happened when you're writing? There's an idea out there.
Everybody does that.
The answer is yes. I'm trying to come up with
And another question I've got, and that's for anyone who wants to answer it, has to do with when you're thinking of this topic here is on history. Do you think history first, or do you think, hey, this is a story I want to write first, and then I throw history in, or does it apple? And so, of course, before the car, or how does that work?
For me, when I wrote Firewatch, how that happened was I was in England for the first time, and I'm the kind of traveler who I do all this research before I go, because I don't want to come home and then everybody said, well, did you see this? And I'm like, no, I didn't even know it existed. So anyway, so I had done a lot of research and before we went. And one of the things was that I read about was the Firewatch of St. Paul's, who were a group of volunteers who slept down in the crypt during the day, and then at night were up on the roofs putting out the incendiary bombs, and they saved St. Paul's Cathedral. Okay. And I thought that would make an interesting, but down in the crypt is where like Nelson is buried, and Wellington, and all these famous generals and everything like that. It'd be really cool to write a poem where you're contrasting those heroes with this different kind of modern hero. So we went to St. Paul's, and we went up in the dome. I took all my notes in the crypt, for this poem, and then we went up to look out over London in the dome, and I was expecting some sort of like Mary Poppins kind of landscape, chimney pots and Victorian houses and all this. Oh no, it's nothing but car parks and cement block buildings on all sides of St. Paul's. And I stood there and went, this sucks. This is not what I wanted. This is a disappointment. And then I went, oh my God, this was all built in the 50s. This all burned down. And then I tried to find the buildings that were still there that hadn't burned down, and there weren't any on all sides of St. Paul's for miles. And at that point I went, this cathedral cannot have survived. Why didn't it burn down? How could it not have burned down? And then from that, I got my idea from my story. But it drew, I mean, so it grew out of history, but it also grew out of my emotional response to a historical fact. And I think without that emotional response, you don't have enough. I mean, all of history is interesting, but you don't need interesting for your stories. You need really powerful emotions.
And for me, I usually come up with plots first, actually, and I'm very careful because I come up with like relationship ideas, and then I kind of find a setting for it, and it's not always historical, but sometimes it happens to match up with something that I think would be cool. And like my Soviet Russian one originally was on a different world, and then I was like, this would be pretty cool here, and I want to research it anyway. There's like certain aspects of history I'll find that I do get ideas for. Like there's the Zazu subculture in France that was like the hippies during World War II. And I really want to write about them because I think they're just not known very well. The Pet Shop Boys did a song about them.
Yeah.
So that's like the story that's been kind of turning around in my mind. I kind of want to do something where, you know, one person was Zazu who had a friend who raised the army and how that relationship with you.
But that's an emotional response to a historical fact.
Always. How can you write without getting emotional?
I don't know.
I like that idea. I'm sorry, I got lost in what you were just saying. Probably this happens to you is triggering something. This is about me, but when I was in school, I was studying the Italian futurists. And they were doing, this is the way it was going to be, possibly, and motion and sound and noise and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, the fascists included them, and they kind of pushed them away. Like, no, that's nice art, but it's associated with music. We don't like this. That was something that was just kind of interesting. And I'm going to throw this out at you from our background. How does art and there's art history. Does that feed into any of the writing and this work as far as art and history and fantasy or sci-fi?
Except tangentially, no. If I'm gonna write about creators in history, I generally write about writers. I've got a whole series about writers. One musician.
I don't know anything about history at all. My understanding is that it is sort of about having a conversation. Knowing it is a conversation. Really, that are creating the conversation. The art is that idea of having a conversation with what's been done before us is very much in line with what we're always doing.
Right. I actually read an essay about how artists inspire each other, and artwork has often inspired me to write something. Like if I found a picture, that's a story. So I use that as inspiration, and I use the music a lot as inspiration because I'm obsessed with music. Like my novel lessons stuff right now. So I think we're all artists. We're all writing stories in one way or another, and these are all forms of art that inspire each other.
Yeah,
I slather art on my architecture. You know, when I'm creating a building or something. But there are gods walking around the barrel on the ceiling, you know, something like that. And go into a invented art history.
Right.
Show it was there.
I'm so text oriented, that not texts, not text, but text oriented, that I end up liking all of the really representational art, and particularly the pre-Raphaelites. I love. And so in specific paintings, I'm sort of right now about the Leipzig Shalott, not just the painting, but no, he's not technically a pre-Raphaelite, he's the next generation, but it's the one where she's sitting in the boat and looking bereft and doomed. And I love that picture. I can look at 1,000 pictures and have no response at all. And that one just like, oh, I know what that's like. I know what that's like. And so the story is actually set in Hollywood in modern times. That has nothing to do with William Shalott, but it's the heart of the story is not only that painting, but then Tennyson's Lady of Shalott.
which goes back into history.
which goes back into history.
And where I teach, I'm going to share a little bit about the folks. And I think they're part of the engagement is running. It kind of looks like alpha deer and whatever, and elongated bodies and thinking so it's the W, and it's this shape of person. And I'm thinking, this is like thousands of years ago, what would happen? That sort of thing, which is inspiration for ideas for people. And I love it. But again, I've seen more movies than I've read. I'm sorry. I just don't have time right now, but I will. I promise. I'll do better. As far as that goes, like when I saw Avatar and saw the creatures in Avatar, and it's almost a ethereal type morphic trees and animals and stuff like that. I was just thinking, this is kind of looking at that and going back to cave paintings. It's not much difference as far as inspiration and history.
Who wrote Clockwork Orange? Burgess wrote Quest for Fire also. Quest for Fire, yes. And Quest for Fire is set back in the pre-language days, in the early man days. And these three guys, their fire goes out. They have fire, but they don't have main fire. They just have fire. So when their fire goes out, it's a horrible catastrophe for the tribe. And so these three guys set out, and one of them is the hero, and he does all the good, kills the man. They have all these adventures, and the other one is kind of comic relief, and he's the comic relief. And then the third guy doesn't do hardly anything. He's always there, but you don't really notice him that much. He's not that important. And then they come back with fire, and the way to make fire. And a girl who knows how to make fire, which is great. And it's a happy ending for the thing. But they get back, and this is where the guy comes into his own, because he's the one who tells the story. And they have just grunts and kind of language. But he's sitting there and he's making a lot of, this is the mammoth and the stab and all this. And this combination of grunts and very primitive language and primitive gestures, and you're just right there with him, and you're like, that's what I do. That's what I do for a living. I do the same thing that he did for a living, and it hasn't changed over all these years. It's still really powerful. So
I'd like to open up to some questions that.
Actually, it's just a comment to what you were just talking about. If you haven't read it, one of the greatest connections between art and science fiction is a story called A Delicate Shade of Kidney by Nancy Kress. It is available online. You can actually read the whole thing online. But if you are an art or an art history person, it is a beautiful combination of questions about how we change culturally, how going out into space or going out to other worlds or when humans come across a different landscape, how it does affect our perception of art beyond the science.
And Nancy Kress is a writer who uses direct history in a lot of her stories. She has a wonderful story about rescuing Anne Boleyn from the block and bringing him forward in time to sort of
What's it called?
She's wonderful.
Delicate Shade of Kidney, Kipney.
We have another question.
Yes, Scott. Yeah, just was wondering, since we're talking about history here, how much of Jack Williamson's earlier works, and from the late 20s, 30s, and 40s, influenced like all the movies in the 50s, like Forbidden Planet and stuff like that?
He did everything. His early things were very pulpy. They were, he has a guy drive to Mars and his stories, which I always thought would be really cool. I would much rather drive to Mars.
Hop in his Ford and drive to Mars.
Huh?
Hop in his Ford and drive.
And drive to Mars. Doesn't that sound cool? It doesn't. And he had, he had monsters from outer space, and he had all the early things that you associate with science fiction. He had all of those in his work, and he was just so, that was his early stuff. Later, he began to influence science fiction through his, he wrote With Folded Hands, which was kind of the first story that had ever considered the consequences of robots and the effect that they would have on humans and their society.
A Frankenstein story.
A Frankenstein story, very much so, but not in a monster tromping through the woods kind of thing.
So in the 50s, then when you had Forbidden Planet and the lovely Ed Wood movies and stuff, were they borrowing from Jack's work? I guess is a question from what you guys have heard. And
Everybody.
I mean, do you think?
Everybody borrowed from everybody.
Yeah, everybody has always borrowed from everybody, and Jack was there at the beginning, and he was borrowing from writers who came before him. It's just that there weren't as many writers that came in.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
There's even, I think, there are the in the early 2000s, because the iRobot movie is supposedly based on Asimov. I think it has a lot of connections to the actual iRobot.
Right.
It was based on a screenplay called Hardwired,
Really?
which my agent sent to me to find out if it was plagiarized from my book. And it wasn't. But at any rate, it was about a mystery. A detective was solving a mystery where the computer was the criminal. And then it got bought and turned into iRobot. So it was not. It didn't start as an attempt to turn Asimov stories into a film. It started as something else entirely, and they sort of wrote Asimov over the top, which is very odd.
So did it find its way to people, or it started with people who happen to have the rights at that time?
It must have. I don't know. Because I read it and I went, there's not enough action in this, and the movie will never be made, and that movie never was made. But we turned into this other thing.
That's why you have to read it under Susan Calvin, robot psychologist, who's out the shotgun.
Right.
Well, there's your Hollywood ending. Whips out a shotgun instead of a slide rule. I mean, if you look at the genealogy of some of this stuff, it really gets interesting. Like space opera. Okay, we're two founders of space opera, and one was Edmund Hamilton, who wrote a lot of big two-fisted space opera. His space navy was integrated. We had aliens on the bridge. There was a woman officer on the bridge who did more than just answer the phone by them. And the aliens were comprehensive. The aliens were attacking Earth and related planets, but they were attacking for a good reason. Their own civilization was under threat. Their environment was being destroyed for one reason or other. They need to come in order for their own survival, they had to come and grab our stuff. Okay, and that is the direct ancestor of Star Trek, including firing beams at people to blow them up and stuff. And he had a series about the Lensmen, who had mystical powers that were granted to them by the lens, and they were kind of a special elite. And basically, that's Star Wars. Star Wars stole every little piece of that and transformed it enough so that it wasn't immediately recognized. But, I think those two writers are the ancestors of pretty much all the space opera that came afterwards.
Well, and it isn't, you were asking, was this influenced by, and did they steal this from? That isn't how it works. I mean, it's those ideas are out there. Everybody kind of grabs onto them and thinks, oh, I'll do this with this. This is an interesting idea. I'll do something else with it. And everybody borrows from everybody else, and everybody's inspired by everybody else, and sometimes directly. And that you read a Jack Williamson story and went, oh, that's interesting, but he didn't think of this, and I could think of this and do this. And then somebody else who's never read Jack Williamson that is inspired by that story, and then so it just, It's like seeding the universe, sort of, and but it's not malicious. It's not plagiarism. It's just more that these are the inspirations for everybody.
Ideas are cheap.
Ideas are cheap.
And people who have very few ideas don't quite realize that there are people who think that certain writers have stolen my stuff. And no, they just used a similar idea to mine. And they're welcome to it. And but these people have only had like 3 ideas in their lives, and they're very precious, and they think that they own these ideas. But I have so many more ideas for books than I will ever write in my lifetime. And so the question is, for me, is not coming up with ideas, but finding the really good ones that I really want to write.
Well, you've heard everybody on the panel talk about future projects that they're going to do and stuff. It's not like they're hard to come by. The hard part is.
Well, the great thing is you can give a story idea to 10 different writers and get 10 completely different stories.
There have been anthologies along the way.
Right, where they give the same story idea to everybody. And they'll have different voices. Amazing.
I recall one where the editor wrote the first scene and then gave it to 5 different writers and said, finish the story. And the scene was the protagonist committed suicide and was dead. So what happened after that? We had 5 very different stories.
Yeah. Well, they did a War of the Worlds retrospective anthology, and I was asked to be part of it, but I'm sure it was inspired not by War of the Worlds, but by a story that Howard Walter wrote called Night of the Cooters. The aliens have the misfortune to have landed in Texas.
Chico, Texas.
Go away,
Chico, Texas.
Chico, Texas.
Yeah, it's just a great story.
And Slim Pickens has to step forward and deal with it.
Exactly.
And George R. Martin has been trying to make a film of this
It would make
for
it great.
decades.
Yeah.
And Howard says, well, you have to have Slim Pickens in it. Slim Pickens is dead.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But apparently it is being filmed.
Oh, good.
It'll be a short film. It won't be a feature.
Yeah. Well, it's a short story. So.
Yeah.
But the stories in that collection were completely different. And I struggled for a while to figure out how to give a spin that I wanted, because I don't really like War of the Worlds that much. So, but then I decided to come up with the idea that if the aliens had crashed into Emily Dickinson's grave, and the story was not about the aliens landing in Emily Dickinson's grave. The story was about the thesis that a graduate student was writing about proving through Emily's poetry that the aliens had in fact crashed into Emily's grave. And I was taking out all of my resentment against English departments and academics and theses and footnotes and all those things, in addition to doing War of the Worlds.
Yeah. I was in that anthology too.
Yeah. And where did
And
yours
I
go?
asked Kevin, when was the War of the Worlds? And he, sort of thought, okay, it's in 1900. All right.
Okay, yeah, you've got it. 'Cause
What was
it's not
happening in
1900,
1900? And I thought, well, the Boxer Rebellion. So you've got the Boxers rising in China to fight the foreign devils that are invading their country, and the real foreign devils.
You go.
Right, and so there's my story right there. Yeah.
Well, he gave me that day too, and then he told me, he said, well, we wanted a woman in the collection. The worst thing that will ever be said to you is a female writer. And he said, and we kind of thought, because the idea was the aliens landed in different places and were seen by different people. So it was Jules Verne in Paris, I think, was one of the other stories. And so they said, we thought of you and Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House. That's even worse than we wanted a woman in this direction. And I was so insulted that anyone would think of me and Laura Ingalls Wilder in the same sentence. I was just infuriated. And he said, well, you don't have to be Laura Ingalls Wilder. You can be Emily Dickinson. I said, Emily Dickinson is dead in 1900. And I went, oh, but that isn't necessarily their category. But you would, if you saw these stories, if you saw them separately, and not in a collection that's called War of the Worlds Retrospective, you would never imagine that they all came from the same the idea was generated by the same thing, because it's just so different and stuff. And you could, and I'm sure everybody in this room could write a world of World's Landing story, and they would all be different again.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah.
Yes, Jack
Yeah,
London.
yeah, I think the basis for that story was that the aliens couldn't survive north of certain latitudes. And so Alaska remained Alaska until the gold rush period.
But one of you, if you want to do that, Lauren, then it's still out. Go right ahead. I'm still not over that. How did you think of me? Me. And Lauren goes wilder in the same. So, why is me? I'll cut me.
I did like the fact though that you reference Night of the Cooters in the footnote to a footnote.
Yes.
Are there some more historical related questions? Historical is pretty wide here. I'm going to throw this out here. There's history that we think of, world history, and then we're actually making history now. In a lot of ways. There's a movie that came out a while ago on AI, about artificial intelligence, and that's getting more and more these days with self-driving cars, self-flying planes, things that we kind of think about. It's actually theoretical stuff. Does that do anything for you guys as writers? It's like, okay, well, this here, please.
I have a book I'm finishing right now. That was very much inspired by that. It says it takes place in like 2093 after all computers have been shut down due to fear of viruses and hackers. And totally legal now, and a robot. So they were trying to avoid the singularity, but turning everything off. So that a robot has turned itself on and uploads itself into the brain of my main character, who then has to fight against the robot trying to take over his mind. And it's illegal. You know, he could kill him. I could say that's definitely spurred by.
No, I would say so.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, I mean, we do that stuff all the time.
Yeah.
The only hazard is that if you write a story very clearly said in a contemporary milieu, it fades. It fades.
It doesn't just
You
date.
get something wrong, yeah.
It doesn't just date, it can be undone by events.
Yeah.
And so there was somebody who'd written a story about an attack on the World Trade Center, and I think it was like 2 weeks before the attack on the World Trade Center. And of course, that story never saw the light of day because it was just, it had been undone by history, and that's something that you always have to bring up and write specifically. That's why a lot of people get themselves clear to that, gazillion centuries so that they don't run into any of those problems. But then a whole bunch of
That came out a few months after, and of course I wrote it 2 years earlier.
Right.
But he got like email.
Right. Yeah. I just predicted it. I didn't do it.
This is not how fast books get published.
But even any story that has the date 2020 in it, from now on, it's just like.
Exactly. Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, the worst story I ever heard of was, I'm not getting this. I was reading a story called Russian Spring, and it was supposed to be about the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was a slow collapse. It was a detente that kind of led to this and then to this and this. And it was a very slow collapse. It came out, and 2 days later, the Berlin Wall fell.
Wow.
And the image on the cover of his book was the statue of Lenin with ivy twined around him and bird's nest in his hair as if he were long neglected. That statue was on the ground 2 days later. And so he just, and it was a really important book and one he really staked a lot of his career on, and it just sank like a rock. So,
Wasn't there a story somewhere about the relationship with Brad and Joanna that came out right about the time they broke up?
I believe so. I believe I wrote that. I was like, who for sure is gonna be around at least 2 years when this book is done? And no, they broke up like the next day. And the next day after I turned it in, so I couldn't do anything. Oh, well. Maybe they got back together. Who knows?
I don't know much of it. He had a movie called a book called Red Sands, in which Russia invaded in 1951. And Pitt was not very good with deadlines. So it ended up being delivered years later. And he had to do major rewriting. It was eventually published, but I think there was, but I think his attempt to update it wasn't successful. I haven't read it myself. I've got 5 to 5.